Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I am a naturopathic physician practicing here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And today I want to talk to you about how your gut is influencing your mental health. But before I dive in there, I just want to give a little shout out to all of my new subscribers. I recently had an influx of you guys and I am so stoked. Thank you so much for supporting my channel and all of the incredible suggestions you have for future videos, and I will slowly chip away at all of those, I promise you that. But yeah, I just wanted to say I'm super grateful to see that you guys are enjoying the content, and I really do try to read all of those comments, so thank you so much. But circling back to the topic, how your gut is influencing your mood or your mental health. So they have actually been talking about this since at least the 1800s. So this might be a new concept to you, but this is not a new concept at all. Of course, back then they were talking about it in a little bit more of a poetic way and maybe using some colorful language. But nonetheless, we are just starting to be able to prove something that we've been talking about for a very long time. And so today I'm going to go over some of the reasons why your gut is influencing your brain and how this is happening. So first we need to define the digestive tract or the gastrointestinal tract. So essentially, these are different organs and things like that that work to help you break down the food that you eat and absorb it and process it so you can use it to fuel your body. This includes a couple key things. So this is going to be your mouth, your stomach, your intestines, your colon, your liver, your gallbladder, your pancreas. And if you want to expand on things, although it's not technically an organ, your microbiome is very important as well. And I'm going to define that a little bit later on. So all of these things work together to help process your food. And as we're going to touch on, it also influences a lot of other aspects of your health. So that's what we're talking about today. In naturopathic medicine, we talk a lot about the importance of gut health, and that is because it is cornerstone to our overall health. So yes, of course, from a nutrition and fueling yourself standpoint, it is very important, but it communicates with the rest of your entire body. It can influence your weight, your immune system. So in fact, 70% of your immune system is actually found inside of the gut, which if you think about it makes sense, right? Because we consume a lot of things. It's a main defense mechanism against what we consume externally. You know, you want a good barrier there, a good defense there in case you are consuming things that need to be eliminated in the body. So yes, 70% of your immune system's found there. Your hormones, so things like bad estrogens need to get put into the stool, and certain bugs inside of there will help make sure that those bad estrogens stay inside of the stool and actually get eliminated and not reabsorbed. It can influence your skin, allergies, so both food and environmental. It can impact your cardiovascular system. And yes, it can impact your mood and your mental health, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, like any of these topics, it's never the whole picture. I don't have enough time to go into all of these things in great detail. That would be an extremely long episode, but I'm going to try and touch on some of the highlights for you because I think that this is something that all of us can relate to. All of us have mental health things going on, whether they're really bad or not, and stabilizing the gut is a very good place to start when it comes to trying to balance your mood and improve your mental health. All right, so now let's jump into one of the main ways that your gut is impacting your overall mental health. And this is a big area of growing research right now. They are learning a ton about this. It is super fascinating. And if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, I am talking about the gut microbiome. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with that term, it is referring to a dynamic population of microorganisms that live inside of the gut. And so this means different bacteria, viruses, yeast or fungi, different parasites, and the things that they produce. So all of these different bugs will really contribute to the health of the gut. And in fact, we have more of them than we do cells in our body. And your stool is actually about 60% bugs. So there is a lot of them here. So it's no surprise that they have a heavy influence on our gut health. Now, the type of bugs that live inside of your gut vary a lot from person to person. And this microbiome is heavily influenced by the environment of your gut. So they will change depending on the food that you eat, the inflammation status of the gut, the medications that we take, the people that we hang out with. So many different things can influence the health of the gut. And you can kind of think of it this way. Different bugs prefer different environments. And generally speaking, the unfavorable bugs prefer a more inflammatory, unhealthy environment. And then this can kind of perpetuate the problem. Whereas if you do a really good job in fostering a very healthy gut environment, low inflammation, you're not putting too many things into your body that are really harmful to the area, then you're likely going to foster the growth of really good bugs that help your health. How these bugs influence your overall health is by releasing certain compounds and actually digesting some of the food for you. So these bugs are very important, and the compounds that they produce and release can get put into your circulation, absorbed into the body, and this is one of the key areas of research right now. And one of the main reasons they know that your gut microbiome can have a huge whole body effect. Now, the last thing I want to mention before I dive into how your gut microbiome is influencing your mood or mental health, I want to circle back to some of the history because I just think it's super interesting. There was a physician in 1898 named Daniel Brower. I think he's based out of Chicago, and he postulated that lack of stomach acid will promote the growth of certain bugs inside of the intestine, and these bugs release toxins that are not good for us. So way back then, he was completely accurate. That is describing something called SIBO. Not the only thing that can happen in this equation, but a very common thing I see in my practice. So I do have a video going over the different types of bloat, and there I talk about SIBO and how this bug overgrowth, which can be related to low stomach acid, happens to create a ton of bloating inside of the body. So I just think it's super wild how these people back then who had very little proof, or at least concrete proof that this was true, were right. And it is actually a very important aspect of our gut health. Okay, so now let's talk about the microbiome in relation to depression, which is something that a lot of people suffer from with varying degrees. They did one really interesting study involving fecal transplants, which means that they take stool from one individual and they put it into another. Now, this study was particularly interesting because they took the stool from a depressed person, a human, and they implanted it into a mouse. And what they found was that those mice that received that particular fecal transplant would then start to exhibit these depressive-like symptoms in their own little mouse way. And interestingly enough, when they studied the stool of the more depressed like mice, they consistently found that there was poor diversity, so not enough of different types of bugs, and more of the less favorable bugs, so like the bad bugs. And it's also important to note that this relationship goes both ways. So if you're depressed, it can influence your gut microbiome. If your microbiome is poor, it can impact your mood and your brain health. And this relationship is very bi-directional. It goes both ways. So that's why you can end up in these really vicious cycles, because your depression is influencing your microbiome and it's worsening it, and then that microbiome, if not corrected, is further perpetuating the depression and things like that. It's super fascinating, but the point is we want to try and break that cycle. And the gut microbiome, they're figuring out what different types of strains have to do with this, and the lack of diversity is certainly a reoccurring theme in there as well. So then you might ask, why is this happening? One of the key theories for why your microbiome has such an impact on things like depression is because of serotonin production inside of the gut. So actually 95% of your serotonin is made by those bugs inside of the gut, which if you don't know much about serotonin, it's referred to as like our happy chemical. In fact, a lot of the antidepressants outside on the market are trying to boost serotonin levels, the release of serotonin, because they know there's a strong relationship there. And so 95% of that is made inside of your gut. So it's no surprise that if you don't have very good bugs inside of there, because different strains will be involved in this process, then your production isn't going to be very good. Now, it's not just serotonin. We have other neurochemicals that influence our mood and behaviors that are also produced by other strains inside of the gut. So we have things like GABA, which is generally referred to as our calming neurochemical. We have things like dopamine, which is involved in motivation, very heavily involved in addictions and things like that. They're produced by different strains inside of the gut. So our microbiome is actually manufacturing a lot of these chemicals that influence mood, nervous system function, and all of these other aspects of our mental health. So if we take medications that wipe out these populations, if we have an inflammatory environment that doesn't promote the growth of these different strains, then you're going to influence the amount of dopamine, GABA, serotonin, and likely other chemicals inside of your brain and inside of the rest of your body. Now, I also want to mention that these chemicals, so serotonin, GABA, dopamine, also have a huge impact on anxiety. So that is just to say that these are also very relevant to anxiety, and depression and anxiety are two of the most common mental health struggles that people will face. So microbiome work is very important in these individuals. Now, somewhat related to that, we are also noticing that the microbiome has a huge impact in our stress response. So again, when they looked at mice studies, they found that mice that had no microbiome, so they wiped out their microbiome, had a very exaggerated stress response. So if they had some stimulus, they would release a ton of adrenaline and cortisol, which is our stress hormone, in response to very little stimuli. So what they found over time was because of this, it actually reduced something called brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is very involved in growth and repair inside of the brain. They talk about it a lot in relation to things like concussion, Alzheimer's, things like that. And this exaggerated stress response was having long-term consequences, which is no surprise. We all know that stress is really bad for the body. But what you might not have known is that your microbiome is also involved in this. So the stress response, depression, anxiety, like who doesn't have at least one of those things going on, has to do with the gut microbiome. It might not be the entire equation, but we are figuring out more and more about the different strains, the different ways we can kind of influence and improve our microbiome in relation to these things that affect our mental health. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the microbiome, because there is just so much we could talk about, and I do want to kind of stick to the highlight reel. But just know that there's a lot more information out there about the microbiome. And if you're interested in talking about other aspects of it, I do hope to go over these in future episodes. But to keep it short and sweet, we're going to move on. Now let's talk about nutritional deficiencies. So of course, this is the more obvious way that our gut and our gut health is impacting our overall body and our mental health, because of course we need our gut to process food, absorb nutrients, and things like that. One thing I wanted to talk about, mostly because it doesn't get enough airtime, is the health of something called our gallbladder. So for example, this is an organ that is very important for fat breakdown. So it'll store bile, which is the key thing that will help you break down fat and absorb it back into the body. Now, we love to cut out people's gallbladders. Gallbladder issues are very common, especially in women, maybe in relation to really bad gallstones, inflammation. If you have a bad gallbladder, it's incredibly painful. So a lot of people will have that removed because of that. It's just creating a lot of pain and discomfort, and you can still release small amounts of bile without it. So to get rid of the problem, they get rid of the gallbladder. But what they don't often talk about is how to get you to absorb those fats without a gallbladder. How do we kind of compensate for the fact that we took away one of these key mechanisms of absorbing fat? And why I think this isn't super important in relation to mental health is because 75% of our brain is fat. And so if we are very fat deficient because we can't absorb our fat very well, this is definitely going to impact the brain. Now, there's a lot of different types of fat out there. And of course, if you're eating higher quality fats, that's going to improve the health of your brain, which is a bit of a different topic. But within these fats, I really did want to also focus in on omega-3s because those are very well studied in relation to brain health. So things like Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety, there's a little bit of studies on all of these different aspects. Omega-3s, for those of you who don't know what they are, is they're a specific type of fatty acid, and they're very common in things like fish, algae, chia, flax, things like that. And so these omega-3s are actually comprising 25% of that fat. So within this whole fat equation, if you're also not getting enough omega-3s, this is really going to impact the health of your brain. So out of all of the fats, all of the different types of fat, that one does have quite a bit of research on it. So imagine this, we already have a hard time getting enough omega-3s in the diet. We typically want to aim for about a 2-to-1 ratio when it comes to omega-3s to 6s, twice as many omega-6s versus omega-3s. So we already are not getting that typically. The average American is getting about 25 times more omega-6s. And if we take into the fact that we're already quite omega-3 deficient with gallbladders, you take the gallbladder out, then we're going to start to notice a big impact on the brain. And they have studied the removal of gallbladder in relation to things like depression, for example. So when they followed these people who had gallbladder removals over a couple years, they were at a 40% increased risk of developing depression, which if you think about it, if you've taken away something that has created a ton of pain and discomfort in your life, you would think you'd probably be a little bit happier. But one of the main reasons they think that is the case is because you're becoming fat deficient. And also, fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, which absorb along with those fats, are also going to be deficient. So the nutritional status of your brain will change in relation to removing some of these key organs of digestion. So that was just something that I thought was super interesting in the literature. A lot of us have maybe lower degrees of maldigestion, which essentially means maybe you're not producing enough stomach acid, which is going to influence protein. Maybe you're not producing enough of your pancreatic enzymes, which is going to influence all of the different nutrients that get absorbed into the body. So that was just something that I thought was really interesting to touch upon. So yes, microbiome is important. The inflammatory status of your gut is very important, which has to do again with a lot of the microbiome health, a lot of the foods we eat, medications, all of these different things will influence inflammatory status as well. And just briefly, because I don't want to ignore that aspect, we also have inflammatory conditions of the gut. So we have things like Crohn's, colitis, celiac disease. So those two, because you have an inflammatory condition, will impact your brain, because if your gut's inflamed, so will your brain be. there is a very strong gut-brain connection. We've talked a little bit about how that's happening, maybe through the microbiome, through different nutritional deficiencies. We have a nerve that directly connects the brain and the gut called the vagus nerve. So there's just so many different influences that can happen here. This relationship is incredibly complicated. So the reason I wanted to talk about these specific aspects of the gut-brain connection is because they're fairly actionable as well. If you have a gallbladder removal, replace those bile salts. If you have microbiome issues, get your microbiome tested. Take some probiotics, get some fiber in there. Figure out a diet that's going to foster a better environment for it. If you have an inflammatory condition, get that inflammation under control. All of these things are, yes, going to help your gut, but they're also going to heavily influence your stress response, depression, your response to things like traumatic brain injuries, anxiety, Alzheimer's. None of us want any of these things. And if we can do something like healing the gut and have that impact our brain in a really big way, I think that's super duper cool. So I hope today's episode was helpful for you. I know I didn't have enough time to really go into everything, but I think at least these aspects are some of the more common aspects of how your gut is influencing your brain health. And yeah, if you have any questions that came up from today, please let me know. If there's any things that you want to add, please also comment those below. And I look forward to seeing you guys again soon.